May you grieve well. This is a phrase that I heard was extended to me several times over the course of the last 10 years. It's been something that's offered a lot of permission for myself to feel the things that I needed to feel when loss came. And recently this phrase came back to me. A friend reached out and she just said, when you handed me that phrase, it allowed me to feel and experience and do the things I needed to do. Is the one phrase that had stuck with her throughout all the phrases that get said at funerals, right? May you grieve well. So hold that as we think about this. I love good conversations around death and the end of things. And one of the things that I've noticed is that in our culture, we aren't very good at holding the tension of a life and the loss of that life very well, and especially corporately. I think about funerals. I love funerals, which is weird, but they're really horrible. I love being in that space because I get to talk to a lot of people and be present with them in a really painful moment. But I don't think any of you, if you have a funeral coming up this week, are like, I can't wait for Friday. That's going to be the moment that I'm really looking forward to, right? Because the cause of the funeral is very painful. But I think even the way that we do a funeral, there's part of that we don't like. So when I think about this big part of our existence, like we all know, no question in our minds, how this ends for us. We have this way of handling it that doesn't seem to be insanely helpful. And it hasn't been innovated in a really long time. Like we're still doing burial in the West like we have for the last 150 years or so. And I think it's a field that's ripe for innovation. So when I think about a funeral, the first thing I think of is how it always seems to fall flat. When you're holding up a life and you're trying to sit with the idea that this thing, this person, this being is done here. And then we go ahead and we say words about them. So I think of the funerals that I've been a part of where the whole spectrum of a life, the fear, the hope, the unrealized dreams, the joy that they brought, the pain they caused, all gets kind of shrunk down into this wide on the spectrum, which is like 4 people stand up and tell the funny, awkward stories from their life. And we're like, funeral over, right, is how some of them end. And it just falls flat. I've done a few funerals in the last couple of years where I felt like that went really well, and yet the words that I said, they fell so short of capturing the life that had been lost. So I think of that. I think of the strange kind of, we live, and I grew up in a very kind of beautiful religious tradition. And even in that, when you're sitting in a funeral, there's this phrase that gets used at the beginning of a lot of funerals, which is, we don't want you to grieve as people who have no hope. And I think what happens is oftentimes we just hear, I don't want you to grieve. And we hold that. There was a guy recently, I got to do a talk on grief for a group of people, and comes up to me afterwards and says, yeah, I got the grief thing down, like figured it out. It's like, cool, I think about this a lot, and I don't. So tell me. And he's like, yeah, like my brother died a month ago, and I felt it all, and it was like a week and a half went by, and I'm good now. Oh, okay. Tell me more. My sister, though, it's been like 6 weeks, and she's still messed up about it. She doesn't understand grief at all. And that juxtaposition to me goes like, this is a microcosm of our cultural conversation. Think about policies that we have in a workplace environment, which are necessary and good. I think they come from a good place, like a bereavement policy. If your spouse dies, it's this many days. If your kid dies, this many days. A brother, a family member, a friend. But it's almost like we've taken the space for grief and said, it's this big, it's this long, compared to a life that this is this big. And we're faced with grief all the time. We're actually about to enter into this really interesting point in our national conversation where baby boomers are going to start dying. And baby boomers there's a lot more of them than there were the generation before. And so we're going to actually see this massive increase in the amount of death that, as a culture, that we're going to be interacting with. I think we need way better ways of holding that pain. So there's phrases, right? Individual phrases that I find myself either hearing or saying to someone, things like, I'm sorry for your loss in the moment of a funeral, which when I've sat with that and said, what does this mean? What does this do? It creates a sense, I think it creates this, it's a good sentiment, but it actually creates some distance between the person in pain and the person delivering the message. I'm sorry for your loss. You imagine hearing that same phrase over and over and over and over and over again in a day. One, if everybody's saying the same thing, it's really hard for those words to mean something. But then again, it creates this kind of, this false sense of closeness. Or the idea, and I've heard it, of someone losing someone close to them, and the phrase, like, God has a plan. If you sit with that for a little bit and just think about the ramifications of that falls apart really quickly, but these are the phrases that get used all the time. And so I think we need new ways of interacting with pain at the end, because it's coming. Like, I can guarantee I know the outcome of every relationship that you have, the people that you're here with today. I know how it ends. With like one small, like by some miracle, you both are in a plane crash together and you don't know what hit you. One of you is going to be left with a massive pile of pain at the end. And the tension there, like my wife is here, and the tension is that the more intimacy that I build with this person, the more carefully I hold that relationship, the more memories and shared history we build together, the more pain will be left at the end. The idea of being afraid of death, to me, it doesn't make much sense anymore, because I don't have to be afraid of it. It is coming. There's no second guessing. And like if you just met, you've been married for 10 years, or not even the super intimate relationships, but think about acquaintances, people that there is a potential for a relationship to exist. Even if you don't experience the pain at the end, we kind of create this, you experience a subtle pain, a quiet pain, where like what could have been doesn't fully bloom. And so there's pain at the end of every relationship. How do we hold that and handle that? When I think of my wife and how it ends, and if I'm the one who's called to bear that responsibility, I hope that our relationship is so good and so beautiful that at the end I am ruined. Like I am maimed by the pain, right? Because of the relationship we built. There's this phrase in funeral world, like, he wouldn't have wanted us to be sad. Again, if we sit with that a little bit and go like, what are the ramifications of that thought line being true? And picture me and my wife, if at the end of our relationship I'm okay after a week and a half, that reveals a lot about the quality of our relationship. Right? It's actually pain at the end that's the metric for the thing. So how do we handle it? There's this old story about a guy who is trying to learn the God's secret name. And he is pestering them about it, and the gods are just resisting until finally they like, let's fight. And so they fight, and they fight all night, and he's trying to like overpower the god. And the gods are trying to just be like, back off, bro. And they end up going until dawn. And finally, the god that he's fighting with, it just says, the text says he touches this man's hip. And for the rest of this guy's life, he's maimed. And I like to think that as people who knew him from years before re-interacted with him, why are you limping? He had this phrase that he's able to say, is because I wrestled with the gods and lived. I think that's the starting point for how do we start holding our relationships better? How do we start embracing the tension of pain and a lost life? So we have to start feeling those things and letting them actually come into our life and maybe even be aware of it during the relationship. So I'm a conflict avoider. I do not like conflict, and yet I love to talk about death. So there's this thing that I think is helpful. When I'm holding in my blind spot and trying to make it very visible that I know how this relationship is going to end, understanding and having a way of thinking about the final conflict and what that means actually informs the day-to-day conflicts. It gets way harder to be an asshole when I'm remembering, oh yeah, this is going to have an ending. And how I handle these conflicts here today are actually that pain, living in that pain well and managing that pain well and letting that pain do work in me and in our relationship is actually going to prepare me to face that final pain. So you got this kind of cyclical pattern. Understand, we know where this is headed. I know where all your relationships end. I'm sorry. That helps us navigate this better, the day-to-day, which then leads us to even begin to have a way of preparing for that final pain. So this guy who says, he's limping, wrestled with the gods and won. Why this is important to me is that I'm limping, right? For the last 10 years, there's been a lot of loss, a lot of pain. Some really good people. I was 12, little Harry, 12 years old, homeschooled, nerdy, still nerdy, homeschooled, and I'm at this event, and I see this guy. He's instantly way cooler than me because he's 15, and that's it. That's all it takes at that age. And this guy, he was with his friends and his people, and he made an effort to come away from his friends and come talk to me and just genuinely was interested in who I was and asked me questions and got to know each other. And he's the person that I learned that it is so valuable. You don't have any idea what kind of impact you have when you talk to people who can't give you something back right away, right? And so he showed me a lot of things. He also introduced me to porn. So there's a spectrum there, right? This is the kind of friend that my parents were probably like, Harry likes Nate? Oh no, what are we gonna do? And it was years later, in my early 20s, I had this phone call where I find out that Nate had been found, beaten to death, his head buried in the sand in California on a beach. Nobody knows who did it still to this day. And before that, there was these phone calls or texts or the occasional run-in that we would see. Man, we need to hang out, right? I want you to hold on to that. Then there's a Bob. Bob was this guy, mentor, role model, first coworker really, on a concrete sidewalk leveling truck. And Bob told stories about hunting goats with bows and arrows. And he also was an addict, and but also sober for I think 18 years when I had met him. Amazing family, rough family. And Bob taught me so much. And then he also thought the way to get oxygen was through the end of a cigar. At least that's how he lived. It appeared that he thought that way. And he died early, right? He died before he could have died way later. And I remember me and my brother Tim and my brother Steve, we knew he was going to pass, and he was on a ventilator and in his log cabin that he'd built by hand with his family. And we got to go over and say goodbye to him. We drove home. About halfway home, we all started feeling it. And when you're 25 and 23 and 21, and you're all hanging out as brothers, you don't really share tenderness in our culture. But we started to weep. And when I say weep, like the snot, the tears, the weird sounds. I would not trade that moment or the life and death of Bob for anything, because I was not afraid of feeling the pain. That pain was in me. I had no choice. But we often do have a choice when we're faced with pain. Often we are afraid of it and put up walls and barriers. Then there's Mike, very similar story. I'm not going to say much about Mike. And then recently I had the immense honor of doing a funeral for one of the kids that was part of a youth program that I directed, a couple of kids, rough life, ended up taking her own life with heroin, and it wasn't like a oops, it was very intentional. And had to sit with a text chain in my phone from 6 months earlier that said, hey, we need to hang out. Oh yeah, I would love to. And that's how that conversation ended, right? There's a guilt there that we feel, and you've probably felt it about certain people. And that guilt is not to be feared, is not to be resisted. You shouldn't tell yourself, oh, but it's okay, you couldn't have known. You should like welcome that guilt to the table and have a seat with it for a while, because it's there to teach you something important about who you are and about how to treat relationships and how to hold them. And then the last person I just got a name. There was a man who's my best friend, showed me everything, right? Taught me everything that I needed to know. Like, I'm not sitting here today without this person. And my best friend, and 6 years ago, he's opened up the door to his CrossFit gym, and 5 guys jumped him. And he resisted. He was also a conflict avoider, but he resisted this time. And it led to him taking a shotgun blast to the torso, and he bled out on a sidewalk at 4:45 in the morning. The pain there is important. So many times we resist it, we don't let it in, we let it go past us. We think we're okay. Man, that pain has so much to teach me. That pain, at the end of all of those relationships, actually helps me understand what the value of the relationship was. If I don't let it in, if I don't listen to it, and if we as a culture keep dealing with pain and loss at the end in superficial ways, it's not going to go good. I think of it like this. It's almost like we've allowed the necessity for sterility and sanitation, sanitary environment that's required in handling a body, to spill over into the way that we think and process it. It's not easy, it's not clean, it's not messy, it messes you up, messes me up, and that's okay. And so hold those people in your mind, the people that you have lost, spend time feeling it. And then the people that you will lose, that you're here with today, that you will go home to, that you will see in the next couple of weeks. My hope for you all is that you would begin now to grieve that well, to allow yourself, to give yourself permission to just fully experience it. You can't get away from it. So let it in and teach you things. So may you grieve well. Thank you much.